when someone's presenting here. Okay, so to kick off the conference, we've got Robin Burgess. I'm eating to his time. He's a professor of economics at LSE and a co-founder and director of the IGC. He's really been the driving force in the IGC. He's director of the Economics of Environment and Energy Research Program at LSE. He just stepped down as the president of BRED, which is the leading network of development economists, and he's co-director of the COAST project. His keynote is entitled Job Variety Firms in Development, which will touch on findings from IGC has a new white paper, which is a good read. I recommend that you look at it, and it'll touch on that, but also talk about broader themes. Okay, Robin, take it away.
So what I'm going to talk about today is essentially trying to look at development through the lens of job variety. And the way I'll do that is to draw from, sorry, how do I just click on that? Yeah. This side. Okay, great. So I go back this way. So I'm going to draw on this set of work, the paper that choose on.
A little bit, yeah, slightly.
Sounds like Robin.
That's the theory.
That sounds like Robin.
Yeah.
Hello?
I could hear
Hello?
it.
Okay, hold on.
That means what's coming up.
I think
Tell them that we can't. That
we need to mute the Yale side. Okay, so these are the work I'm going to draw on. So the white paper that Chris mentioned, and then a couple of published papers on Bangladesh, and then some new stuff, which is a new kind of project, I guess, which has been driven by Anton, who's here, Oriana, Ahmed, and Andrea, which is basically to kind of popularize to you this new data set that they've put together, and hopefully many of you can use it. But it also is a kind of good prelude for thinking about what job variety looks like around the world and how it correlates with a bunch of stuff. And then we're going to go into sort of two very incipient projects. One is on Brazil, where we're trying to look at different parts of Brazil to see how job variety has evolved over time. And Brazil's great because it kind of almost encompasses the whole world in terms of, very, very low job variety settings like the Northeast, to very high job variety settings like Sao Paulo. And then finally, an even newer project on Korea, where we're going to be looking at place-based industrial policy and thinking about how that affects diversification of jobs and employment. Okay. So we started, I will try to, keep ourselves on time. But I think the sort of broad reason I wanted to present this stuff together was because I feel there's a little bit of a disconnect between micro development, so the kind of stuff that I've typically done, just sort of focusing on very, very low income places, typically in the rural parts of those low income places. And so essentially in settings where there's incredibly low job variety. And that's where Bangladesh will come in. And then there's sort of more macro development, which is thinking about structural change. It's thinking about going into manufacturing to services. And that is really the thing that is sort of driving, us across the arc of development. So if we think about, where we're headed today, which is sort of from Bangladesh to South Korea, you're really moving across, the creation of more and more types of jobs. And typically that's occurring through firms. So people are coming together in firms, becoming more specialized and becoming more productive as a result. So we're not going to have anything very sort of deep to say in a causal sense, but hopefully we'll be able to kind of throw out some ideas about this might be a good lens to look at development through. So it's going to be a lot of graphs and descriptive material, but hopefully it'll sort of spark new research. So these are the three areas I'm going to look at, and we'll also show you a bunch of work from the Jobs of the World project, looking at the whole world. And I think one thing that is important is to sort of also push people to start to think about why it is that when you have more and more job variety appearing, that makes people more productive. So is it something to do with being better matched to better matching of your abilities? And that's sort of an area of theory which is developing, which I think there could be a lot more of, because clearly something happens when you move from just, say, having a few jobs sort of cultivating maize, a few other things, to becoming specialized. And if you're a very good designer, you get matched to design. You're very good at marketing, you get matched to marketing, which is not possible when you have 3 jobs which are available to you. Okay, so the most striking things we'll be showing you is just how strongly correlated job variety is to economic development. Okay, so let me just begin with Bangladesh, and this is sort of not quite a eureka moment, but what we did, we were designing this survey in 2006 to capture jobs, and we came up with all these names. Some of these are added from the other category, but there's, as you can see, a large number of possible jobs that might be happening in rural Bangladesh. And it turns out that essentially, when we actually did the survey, and I'll just show you the results for women, that basically there's 3 jobs. So all these jobs, you could have been any of these things, but in effect, you were basically one of 3 types of jobs. And these are basically, many of you have seen this stuff before, you either in terms of 80% of the hours, you were either a casual laborer, you were a domestic maid, or you were rearing livestock. And so this is sort of true across branches. These are BRAC branches on the bottom here, and these are the share of hours. So getting up to 80% of the hours, you were kind of one of these 3 things. So it's a kind of very, very limited job. And that was sort of one big finding that we when actually did this, because people hadn't done this type of survey before. And also the fact that as we moved across the wealth distribution, that it really was the richer women were all doing the green, the livestock rearing, whereas the poor women were doing very little of that, and they were mainly doing this very itinerant wage laboring. So this is all kind of informal wage labor. So in effect, the BRAC program that we evaluated was trying to move people into the more green activity that the richer women were doing. So I guess what's sort of striking about that work we did, and I'll just show you, this is sort of the poverty trap figure you've seen. If we compare women who were pushed over this 45-degree line by the program, not only did we see that they got richer, they acquired many more productive assets, not just livestock, but beyond that, land and so on. But they also began to work much more on productive assets. So I guess the key finding here is we didn't really change job variety. The 3 jobs that were there remained there, but there was a big improvement in welfare from pushing women into the kind of more productive type of job. But what we also have to remember is it's still a very limited improvement. It was very, it was fundamental for these very, very poor women, but it certainly wasn't pushing them off off towards South Korea or any kind of high income type of status. So that's sort of the first bit of stuff. So this is very low job variety. And a lot of development economics is really about this sort of area. It's sort of giving more credit, more training, trying to move people into slightly better jobs. But it isn't often very transformational in the sense that it's not moving you right across the arc of development towards sort of middle income, high income status, right? So as a result, most of development economics tends to be focused on low income parts of the world. Africa, rural parts of South Asia are the typical sort of focuses. I mean, exactly the areas where, for example, the International Growth Center, because it had this sort of poverty, getting people out of poverty focus has been working. So now let me just show you that and this is not work that I did. I mean, Anton was involved and many others, but this is basically an attempt to sort of take a bunch of DHS surveys at IPUM, so there's 99 countries in here, and just to see how does work sort of change over over GDP per capita. So the first sort of thing you see is that as you get into richer countries, you see that there's not a massive change in the sort of share of work, but there's more and more paid work. So the first sort of bifurcation is you see more and more paid work are coming in and less unpaid work as a share. So that's one change you see across that GDP per capita distribution. And then interestingly, if you look at paid work, then you see that the richer people are doing more paid work. These are wealth quintiles using an asset index. But if you look at men and women, you can also see that the men are working a lot more in paid work, right? So the women are working much less across instances. It increases the amount of people doing paid work increases across GDP per capita. So that's a very strong across the income distribution effect, but also very different for men and women. And then if we think again of the kind of things that macro development people are interested in, you start to see this very clear reduction. This is sort of now the first bit of evidence on firms that as you move across GDP per capita, you're seeing less and less people involved in self-employed work. So you're moving from very, very tiny firms into bigger and bigger firms. Because this, remember here, is typically, particularly as we move across here, salaried employment. So it's not the kind of daily wage labor that we were talking about in Bangladesh. It's actually people working in a firm, getting a salary, regular salary, having an employment contract with that firm. And those firms getting ever bigger. Okay. So there's a clear sort of change, and the fit of the data is pretty clear. So there's basically kind of this big thing in macro development, which is as you look at richer countries, they tend to have bigger firms and people are more productive in those bigger firms. And a lot of the discussion is how do we move from this sort of massive, tiny self-employment type firms into these much bigger firms where people can specialize. And as we'll see, that change is also associated with an explosion of job variety, which is going to be the main focus of what I talk about today. Okay, so if we now look at some of the sort of standard things that we would want to focus on, which are well known, you see that the share of work in agriculture comes down. That's also associated with a fall in self-employment and a rise in wage work. And that also is associated with other sectors such as manufacturing and services coming up. When you look, you're seeing this sort of fall in self-employment and rise in wage work. One thing I should mention is, which I forgot to at the beginning, is that the Jobs of the World project is also very distinct because it manages to capture all work. Doesn't capture unproductive work like housework, but for example, if you're if you're growing maize and eating that maize, there's a lot of that kind of activity is common, you will be in the data set. So it's not just capturing people who are kind of informal work, it's sort of capturing the all work in the world, which is one big sort of advance. Okay, this is now sort of another big theme. There's a whole program on this in the IGC. Is so what's happening with urbanization. So you see as there's more urbanization, so this is the share of urban population, this well-known sort of, as you become more urban, you become, you move to higher GDP. And what's interesting here is if you break this out, this self-employment wage work, you see that the kind of crossing of wage work is at a much lower, for the urban parts of countries is much earlier. So you're seeing this, people, even more rapidly moving into wage work in urban areas and rural areas. Okay? So you're starting to see that a lot of the sort of themes that people have thought about in terms of the kind of wealth of nation questions are showing up as happening outside the typical domain of development economics, which tends to be kind of rural, low income, low job variety settings. Okay, so let's now look at the sort of this up by gender. And you'll see here that as you sort of now are only looking at wage work, you see this clear thing that the richer people, so this is the richest quintile, they're the ones that tend to be more across the distribution, more likely to be engaged in wage work relative to the bottom quintile. And that is also more the case with men. The women, again, this is very clear ranking. And again, men are even more likely to be engaged in wage work, which also starts to explain why men tend to have higher incomes and so forth, which is something which is a kind of intense interest at the moment.
Robin, can I ask clarifying?
Yeah.
Question? Is this picking up labor force participation, or we're thinking this sums to this is only people who are active in the labor market? These are shares, conditional. I mean,
yeah. So I think it's all people who are productive and in the labor market. So it would involve, you know, people who are but it wouldn't include people who are, say, homemakers.
You keep saying that, but homemakers are productive. I think you don't.
No. But I'm saying that they're not in the data set.
Yeah, and not in the, yeah.
So we'll when we come to the job variety, we will be including that, and you'll see that that varies dramatically across men and women. Okay, so if we come to sort of now the sort of main focus of what I want to talk about, job variety. In this type of data, you're kind of limited basically to census type of information, because things like the DHS will not give you the job variety information. So what we're going to do now is sort of to focus upon the job variety question, and again using the data sets from this the standard classification of occupations, ISCO. We're going to be able to look at 9 major groups, 372 possible job types at the 3-digit level. So we'll start with the international, and then we'll go into Brazil. And the measure we're going to focus on is basically the smallest number of distinct 3-digit codes that jointly make up 90% of the workforce. Okay, so that's going to be our measure. If we look at this, just to give you a sort of sense of what these 9 layers of ISCO are, they move from the 9 to be kind of and this is supposed to be kind of moving up the skill distribution. So you're moving from kind of elementary, so a street vendor, somebody who's just operating in a factory, crafts, agriculture, services, clerks, technicians, professionals, and these are all examples of types of jobs within each of those 9 ISCO layers. Now, if we then take this definition and sort of look at it across countries, it's worth kind of just throwing out a few countries. So these jobs in Mozambique in the 2007 census account for 90% of the jobs and of the workforce. So you'll notice here that you get a small number of jobs. You don't have many who are in the kind of 1-2 category. So there's fewer of those very, very skilled, for example, professionals and the like. And then if we move along to another country, there's India. In the 2009 census, you start to see more job variety, and it's worth just sort of looking at these are fairly deep jobs. There's 372 possible jobs out of this, and you're starting to see more of these, business professionals, directors, chief executives, and so forth, as well as, of course, many at the bottom. So if we think forward to Brazil, the beauty of Brazil is you have areas which are very Mozambique-like, And then the other areas are not even India, like they're more like the next one, which is France, where you see there's an even a much larger number of job varieties that account for 90% of the workforce. So this is kind of an interesting way of looking at development, because you could imagine that, depending on the theory you're thinking about, that having a higher availability of job types allows people to match their ability to those things. That if everybody's growing maize and cassava, there's not much you can do in order to improve your productivity. You're kind of constrained just by the inability to have choice in the work that you do. So you either migrate to the city, if you're living in a rural area, you migrate out of the country in order to match. So even if you think about a city like London, London is rich because people come from all over the world and get matched to interesting professions which they're good at, right? So they're coming even from, other cities in Britain, they're coming from Europe, they're coming from all over the world. And that matching of people to those jobs makes London very, very productive. That works? Okay. Okay. Do I have to point it somewhere?
Yeah, maybe you just continue with the last one.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, it worked.
I don't think so.
Okay, no, right. Let's get to the
Okay, so that's France. So let's now kind of begin to kind of look at the world. So this is our measure, the number of jobs accounting for 90% of the workforce. And then this is GDP per capita. Okay, so we're going across this in logs from 6 to 11. And you can see there's a very clear and actually quite tightly fit relationship between, with Ethiopia, Rwanda, Mozambique, which we just saw down here, and moving all the way to Switzerland, Britain, and so forth, right? So and if you look here, it's quite a big change. It's sort of moving from sort of 8 to 50 different types of jobs accounting for so there's a big expansion in job variety as we move across GDP per capita. The other thing is, if you look historically, and Anton put this together, it's not exactly the same ISCO code, it's some ISCO 68 thing. Anton put these series together for countries which are now kind of richer and industrialized. So you've got Sweden, Canada, Scotland, Norway, England, Wales, and you can see across their sort of development process, again, there was a big increase in job rights. So you can imagine, you're in Manchester, people are doing some food processing or something, most of the people in the countryside, and then the Industrial Revolution happens and a bunch of stuff starts to happen in Manchester, new jobs are created, you can become a factory operator, you can become an insurance salesman, you can do, because you remember that the job varieties are not just in the kind of manufacturing sense, it's all the kind of other things that fit around those new types of economic activities. So historically, it also seems to be the case that you see this. And then this is a really interesting graph in the sense that it really is suggesting that this is just doing it for self-employed and for separately. And you can see that the real sort of increase in job variety is really happening as a result of wage work. You can go a certain distance in self-employment, but then if you want to get into the kind of higher levels of job variety, is happening through wage work. And that's where the firm comes in, because the firm is the thing that allows you to group workers, allows them to specialize, and for job variety to expand. Now, of course, these are all measures that are not at the firm level. They're aggregate country measures. So one way to think about this is, as that process happens, so for example, people move into the cities, more firms are set up, then even if it's not just happening in that firm that set up job variety expansion, there's other firms that are forming, restaurants are forming, banking services, et cetera, that input providers into those firms. So this is sort of the aggregate growth in job variety. And one thing that's going to be advantageous about Brazil is we're going to be able to get into the firm level and begin to sort of figure out how much of this coming from the firms that, for example, are exporting, say, more to China, and other firms that are then servicing those firms or providing inputs into those firms. Okay, so keep this graph in mind because we're going to do something very similar for Brazil. This sort of captures across the distribution what's happening in these 9 categories. And it's very clear that, you know, overall, this ISCO 1 level, you're just seeing a huge reduction in agriculture, and then a rise in pretty much all the other categories. So that's kind of a striking picture of the sort of change in the composition of jobs. Okay, so now let me just show you a kind of some slightly more detailed graph. So what we're doing here is we're accounting for how many jobs. So each of these little lines here on the bars, these are the countries we have data for. So Switzerland to Ethiopia. So you can see immediately there's many, many more jobs in Switzerland than there are in Ethiopia. Okay? And then what we've done is to begin to shade, and I'll come to that, what types of jobs are these by color. But even more than that, we're looking at the years of education on average, because it's from census data, that you need to do that job across the whole world. So in other words, if you're green and you're a tractor driver, if you're doing tractor harvesting or something, that's probably going to require more skill than if you're just a laborer. So then that will get a darker green color. So we're showing you this without the color, so you can just see this very, very striking increase in the number of jobs as you move across GDP per capita. And then when you do this, so this is just to give you the sort of shading within each of these. You can have these shadings based on average years of education. We then see the really beautiful picture, which is this one, where you're seeing now with the color that not only are you seeing a reduction in things like agriculture and a rise in crafts and so forth, but particularly a rise in the professional types of jobs. But interesting, when you look at this more carefully, as you move in this direction to sort of richer countries, then you're seeing more of the darker colors within the color zones. So in other words, even within agriculture or crafts or professions, it's the more highly educated people who are, and as you get more of them, you're getting more and more splitting. So you imagine, an industry where there's, 1 or 2 people, like somebody is doing all the accounting for the whole firm, but then you get different types of accountants, and you get this sort of need for more skilled, trained people. So this is a very, very striking graph in showing you how work changes in terms of job variety across the world, at least for those countries which have the requisite data. This picture is doing it for rural and urban, and you can see immediately that the main difference is that for urban, they look more similar across countries. In other words, many of these urban African countries look much more similar than the developed countries. But for the rural, they look completely different. They're sort of almost entirely focused on agriculture. So you definitely get more jobs, as we know already. As you move in this direction, it's more skilled, but it's much, much more striking for the rural areas. In other words, in this direction, there's much less agriculture. There's many more of the other types of jobs. If we then do this, going back to and actually factor in work sort of done within the home, so this could be done by men or women. So you can see that the blank part is the household work done by men. There's a huge distinction between men and women. So here, this is counting, basically scoring household work as a job that should be done. And you see that there's a huge difference. And across the world, that seems to be, in many places, the dominant work that is done by women. In some countries, the only work, I think this is Iraq, done by women. So this is beginning to show you sort of how different it is in terms of when you factor in household work or as
It's muted. So Robin, can you hear us here?
yes.
Okay, good. Well, just to break the ice a little bit, but my question was about there's some arbitrariness in how these occupational categories are defined, right? So if I think of a shoe factory, I think of a shoe factory operator. In fact, if you go there, there's 15. There's people who do the soles, there's people who do the stitching, people who put the shoelaces, this sort of thing. And I wonder whether, in part, the reduction in numbers of jobs, the increase in numbers of jobs as you get richer, is in part the fact that we're sort of a little bit too coarse in agriculture in the occupational definitions, that maybe there are different occupations there. And I know that wasn't true in Bangladesh, but where if we were a little bit took a closer view and talked to people on the ground, they might say there's many more occupations within agriculture that are showing up in the data.
Yeah, I mean, my sense is that there is some division within agriculture, but certainly what typically say relative, so sort of the crafts or the purple on the bottom, which is the mainly sort of factory works and the like, that you do get less divisions. Whether that's in reality or because of the scoring, I don't know. But certainly that could be a factor in driving the greater sort of job variety to the right. I think, for example, in something like professional services or the like, then that probably is real, because essentially what's happening, remember, is that in many of these censuses, you wouldn't even have a job called IT something in a very, very poor country. That job at some point arrives, gets scored into the census. So there is a sort of a need, if there's somebody who's doing work that hasn't been classified before, to be added in. So I think the way the censuses work is they add those in, obviously, the international list. So the international list may be too coarse in the case of agriculture, but I don't really know whether that's the case. I'm not. It's possible, but I don't think it's automatic. Okay. So I think the next sort of the thing I wanted to focus on now is sort of more kind of work that's going on, at the moment. And this is a bunch of work with Gabriel and Anton, who are here, and Oriana. And what we did is we sort of searched around the world. We looked at India, and we were looking for basically a big country that had areas with very low job variety and high job variety, because ultimately we kind of want to start to understand like what drives the creation of job variety and to what extent it goes through firms or other factors. Obviously, things like trade become important, because trade allows you to, whether it's within a country or across countries, allows you to kind of expand markets, potentially specialize more. So what I'm going to describe today is almost entirely descriptive. I think is going to be interesting, hopefully, in convincing you that Brazil does sort of capture the world. And the data we're going to be using is essentially two censuses from 2000 and 2010. We have 107 industries. So these are the industries. And we've got the kind of main geographical unit going to be micro regions. You want to think of these as sort of commuting zones. So there's 558 of those in Brazil. And the average population of one of those is about 340 in 2010, second census, about 340,000 people. Okay. So if we go through the same exercise, we can firstly see that this is just shading by job variety, that there's a big difference between, say, the Northeast, which is the poorest part of Brazil, to some of the bigger city areas like Sao Paulo and Rio, where you start to get into much darker This is sort of a first attempt to say that there's a lot of variation within Brazil. And if we then also just sort of begin to look at, this is going back to earlier censuses, so we're now sort of showing you how the share of people with no education has fallen using each of these micro-regions and adding 2 more censuses. Again, you see that, this is Portugal here, this is Mali here. You're kind of covering the micro-regions of Brazil, sort of cover the full educational range. You see similar things for share in agriculture, similar things for self-employment, the fall in self-employment over time. So the first thing, which I think is really striking, is if we do, this is the graph you've already seen of the jobs accounting for 90% of the workforce across the world. So this is the world. And then this is micro-regions in Brazil. So it really does look like, you've got this very similar distribution of rising numbers of rising job variety as you move across GDP. So that's one point. The second point is that if you look at the log GDP per capita support, you're not quite getting to Ethiopia, but you're getting almost the whole of the distribution of GDP per capita in the world in this one very large country. So that's sort of an interesting place to then begin to think about what is it that means that the Northeast has very limited job rights. Is it just because they're just a mass of small farms, like in the African countries, so the big firms haven't arrived there? Why haven't they arrived? Yeah.
It's lost connection. They are troubleshooting,
Okay.
but they can no longer see the presentation. So maybe if we give it a minute, if anyone has a question,
Sure.
Feel free to ask it now.
Yeah.
I was just wondering about the institutions in Brazil and how that is going to interact with what you're saying here to maybe increase or decrease comparability with the global distribution.
Yeah, I don't think we've arrived at such a detail. I mean, at the moment, so Brazil, I guess, over this time, 2010, 2000, obviously democratic. But yeah, I mean, there certainly isn't obviously within Brazil institutional differences. And I guess we haven't, or at least I haven't looked at the world data and try to figure out whether particular political systems are associated with more or less job variety. So I think the answer, we haven't done anything on that front. Yeah.
So I have 2 clarifications, please. So first, is there anything within Brazil data versus across country data that would allow you to say something about job quality, not just job variety? So where am I coming from? I was noticing that Romania and Great Britain were very similar in terms of job variety. But my hunch is that they're very different in terms of job quality and exactly what they're doing in those particular jobs. So I was wondering whether this is something you could condition on or you could clarify further.
Yeah, we haven't done this yet, but and Gabriel might have something to say about this, but we're going to use that rice data. We've got the rice data, and so from that data you could figure out, I think, if you have, say, an IT engineer, and that IT engineer is up in the Northeast, how many years of education, something like that, has that person got relative to the IT engineer in Sao Paulo? And so going back to the London analogy, maybe the really high-end IT engineers come here, and the slightly less globally competitive ones stay in Romania. But that's the only thing I could think. Certainly that's the consideration. So at the moment, what we're doing is we're just having a look at proliferation actually today of job variety. We're not really, yeah.
So do you want us to think more about industry structure as related to that, or about division of labor and transmission?
I think when we come to stuff we haven't done, which is all the firm level stuff. I do think that the question of sort of, I guess there's two ways of looking at the one way of looking at it is trade, and Brazil has done very well off trade with China, and there's certain characteristics of certain micro regions that made them, you know, attractive. They could produce the goods that China wanted. So you could use that to think about how the expansion of the market expand, and then from that you could also look at not just, because basically with the rice data, as far as I understand it, you aggregate from the worker into a firm, because you know everybody, at least all the formal employees of a firm, and so you can get to that. So you can look not just at the people who are, say, the soybean whatever conglomerate that are trading with China. You can look at other firms that may be working with that sort, you know, the car dealership or the apartment renters or whatever around that. So I think that's one in terms of the, so that's sort of, and then the other way in would be infrastructure, you know. So if there was more roads built or ways to kind of connect up these places better, then that might also be a factor in expanding markets and acting as a sort of push for job variety. We've tried various things to do with demand for labor in agriculture, because various GM, soy, and other things came in. As far as I understand, we haven't got very far with that. So we're focusing on the China thing at the moment. Yeah.
So the argument that we have is the more job variety there is, there's a correlation with development. I'm curious as to understand how much heterogeneous the data collection is in these countries, because the censuses, I'm guessing, are not all created equal. So whether that also plays a factor.
You're saying that they're making up data, or they're just less careful? I mean, a lot of this GDP.
Let me give you an example of that. When you showed the US data, the number of occupations between 2000 and 2010 changed so much that I have to believe that was something that they did differently.
Yeah.
That they categorized things more finely.
Yeah, well, exactly. They were more careful on adding.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that's entirely, I mean, I don't know the data well enough. I think there's less of the sort of just filling in the gaps sort of stuff that you see with, you often see with GDP data, particularly for Africa. But it's certainly entirely possible that they didn't bother to add in a bunch of jobs which did exist and continue to categorize them in a different thing. But I'm not sure how we'd get into figuring that out. Okay, anything from Yale? Are you back on?
I think they're back, yeah.
Okay, I think I will continue so that we finish on time. So this is sort of at least promising that we have something to look at in Brazil, and then because we can categorize them by self-employment. Again, you see this picture that the kind of rise in job variety is being driven by wage work, at least into the higher, which goes back to the firm. But at the moment, we don't have a firm boundary to play around with because we haven't done the firm level analysis. Anyway, so that's an interesting sort of picture of what's happening in Brazil. And just to remind you, that's what the world looks like, right? So again, we see a very similar picture for Brazil, but of course for Brazil, we have the advantage of many more micro regions, a common government, and so there's sort of less, other sources of variation to be driving job variety. Okay, so we'll look at what I'm going to do in the remaining time is just show you some of these rather beautiful graphs for Brazil, and then say 2 minutes about Korea. So this is again showing you that as you move, so this is the poorest, this is some place, I think all the way from, if I'm remembering rightly, from MA to BA is the northeast of Brazil. And those are the places with the poorest areas, the lowest job variety, and then you're moving up to Brasilia, which is the highest job variety places. So there's a clear, it's clear that the job variety variation is there. And then if we do this with colors, again, using the same categorization, ISCO categorization, it's less pronounced. So there's more of these other types of jobs, even in the poorest parts of Brazil. But again, you see this quite clearly. And if you start to look at this more carefully, you start to see more of these types of jobs appearing and then becoming darker within the broad slabs of the 9 broad slabs of the ISCO classification. So remembering that we're moving here from the least skilled, the kind of up to the most skilled. So the tops are things like government officials, these are professionals and the like. Okay, so let me just quickly run through what it looks like. And now you see something. So in rural Brazil does look very agricultural. And as you move into urban, you're seeing something which is, again, like the world, more similar. So it's, in other words, what we're saying is maybe even in the city in northeastern Brazil, things look a lot better in whatever state this is, sorry, I don't know what's it called?
Maranhão.
What?
Maranhão.
Maranhão. There's much more job variety. So presumably one initial thing you can do if you want to access job variety is to move to the city, and then you might want to move from the city, off into even higher job variety places. And going back to the point, maybe these little slabs, these are kind of more remunerative types of jobs, even though they're classified in the same way within job. So remember that when we get to the firms from the RICE data, we'll be able to also look at wages. Yeah. Okay. This is men versus women without bringing in household work. And you can see there's quite big differences in terms of less in the sort of factory work areas, more in the crafts and the like. But this is what when you do bring in household work, so you classify a household work as a slightly different definition national. But again, you see this huge difference between the work, because obviously the white should be categorized as work. And you see this huge difference again in Brazil versus with a reduction, as we saw in the world, as you move towards richer states of Brazil. Okay, so I'm going to just say 2 things and then finish on Korea. So the first thing is what if we just say, well, what's the relationship between jobs which represent 90% of the workforce and total employment controlling for region, industry, fixed effects, and year? So this is pooling the 2000 and 2010 survey. So if you do that, you basically see that as you have, so this is not at the firm level, it's at industry level. Remember, there's 107 industries. So if you have within your micro region a bigger, an industry with more employment, then you tend to have more job variety. So this is not, this is just showing you a kind of a relationship. If we then do it well, what happened between 2000 and 2010? So now we're looking at the growth in employment, the growth in job variety. So if you had more growth in employment, so controlling for the industry times microregion fixed effect, then you see greater growth in job variety. So we're just using the variation between the 2000 census and the 2010 census. So this is our sort of first piece of evidence that is looking at what might be sort of driving job variety. I've mentioned a few of these things, and I think given the time, I won't get more into this. But one thing which we're sort of focusing on now is this rise have, because it allows us to, from the perspective of the worker, to aggregate up to the firm and to get things like characteristics of the worker, how educated are they, what wages they're earning. And what we're going to do first, we think, is to use the kind of huge growth in trade in China to see where the places that sort of were particularly advantageous saw greater growth in job variety. So I think what I'll do just to finish, and I now only have 2 minutes, is to say two things about Korea. And this is a much more, so these are the sort of things we want to think about. Some of these have been raised as they're more firm entry, employment and wages, job variety, because we really want to begin to understand what has been the role of the firm in driving job variety. And is that sort of within firm, or is it because other firms are coming in around firms that are exporting to China? I've mentioned already that we're sort of interested in what sort of theory to think about. But I think in the interest of time, let me just say, finish with Korea. So this is literally done in the last few months. So I wanted to finish with Korea because we've been now working on Korea for, I guess, a year. And we're particularly interested in it because it moved, I think it moved most quickly from low income status to Philip here, who's going to be on the job market, works on exports in Korea. And it's an astounding country in terms of how quickly it's moved across the arc of development. But then the question is, how did they do that? So all I'm going to show you today is sort of some data. So these dots are where the industrial parks were put in, which were one of the major policies to drive industrialization. So this dot is an industrial park. And as we move across time, more and more added across the country, you're ending up with almost 20 of them. And then this is show you the one in employment. This is what happened to employment in fabricated metal. So this things like cars, shipbuilding, computers, and the like. So you saw this huge rise in employment. And so what I'm going to show you, which is pretty basic, is this sort of ATHI diff and diff, synthetic diff and diff on what happens to employment when you put in an industrial park. So just to show you that, we've got, this is 72. So this is of the parks that were put in 72. This is what happened to employment in fabricated metal. So you see this huge rise in employment in fabricated metal. And remember that where we're trying to get to here is to think about how, because this is like place-based industrial policy, shoveling in huge amounts of money into these particular areas, many of which are sort of predominantly agricultural. And I guess if we line all of these up, and I will finish, I know that I'm supposed to, you can see that, so this is employment, and this one, which is the most interesting, is you line them all up using, and obviously this is partly because there was very little else. You see this both rising, so this is 21 years out, big effect on the rise in employment. So what we've recently got from the Statistics Authority in Korea is all the, I think it's 5-digit employment codes. So we can then begin to see like how, not only did that sector, like the metal shipbuilding, which we can make more finely grained, but did other firms come into these areas because the state had pushed all this money into that particular sector. And the reason I finish on this is industrial policy is in the air. And one big question is, can you sort of fast track this kind of job variety creation and associated development? Because I think for too long, a lot of development economics is just sort of what I was describing in Bangladesh, which is to make very, very, very poor people slightly less poor. And that maybe we want to be a little bit more ambitious on that in terms of thinking that eventually they'll get to the richer parts of Brazil, or maybe even Korea. Okay, thank you.